We spoke with the President Donald Trump about joint actions, the support of the United States that is so urgently needed, and pressure on Russia, pressure for the sake of peace. We discussed the situation on the front lines. We discussed diplomatic efforts. We talked about how to bring closer a real and lasting ceasefire for at least 30 days. That could open up many opportunities for diplomacy. Ukraine is ready for a full ceasefire starting right now, from this very moment, a 30-day silence. But it must be real. No missile or drone strikes, no hundreds of assaults on the front. The Russians must respond appropriately by supporting the ceasefire. They must prove their willingness to end the war. This isn't the first time. We are offering this once again. 30 days that could become the beginning of years of peace. A ceasefire, lasting and reliable, will be a real indicator of movement toward peace. America can help with this. The world needs America now, just as it did 80 years ago.
US President Donald Trump had a phone call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Chinese leader Xi Jinping urged Putin to end the war in Ukraine by making a fair deal. Russian dictator Putin has hosted a military parade in Moscow. So what is known about the latest negotiations between President Zelensky and Trump, and how does China put pressure on Russia? Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke with US President Donald Trump on a phone call on May 8th to discuss the war in Ukraine, pressure on Russia, and ceasefire. Two leaders had a good conversation that was warm and constructive. They congratulated each other and their respective nations with Victory Day in Europe. Zelensky also commented on how the defeat of Nazism as well as the cooperation between allied nations laid the foundation for peace and international law and normal life for so many countries. Zelensky and Trump also discussed actions, including US support for Ukraine and further pressure on Russia. They also discussed the frontline situation, diplomatic efforts, and a real and lasting ceasefire in Ukraine. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump, after speaking with President Zelensky on May 8th, says that the US was demanding a 30-day ceasefire. Quote, the US is demanding ideally 30-day ceasefire. Let's hope that acceptable ceasefire will be respected and both countries will be responsible for upholding the sanctity of these direct negotiations. If the ceasefire is not respected, the US and its partners will impose additional sanctions. Trump again reminded that thousands of young soldiers are dying every week and everyone should want to stop this war. Trump remains committed to ensuring peace between Russia and Ukraine together with European allies, and it should be the lasting peace. Trump also confident that a ceasefire should ultimately lead to a long-term peace agreement. At the same time, Trump's administration begins to understand that Putin is not really interested in a peace deal. US Vice President J.D. Vance says Russia was asking for too much. During negotiations over Ukraine, Vance calls the demands made by Russia during current discussions as too big and said that Russia cannot expect to be given territories that it could not even capture. US President Trump also spoke about whether Russians want peace. The US leader noted that Vance is right when he says that Russians are asking for too much in negotiations on Ukraine. Moreover, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent agreed that Putin is a war criminal. When he was asked by Democratic congressman, do you consider Putin a criminal? Bessent answered yes. At the same time, Bessent supported negotiations with the Russian side.
Obviously, I think it was the right thing to do for us to start the process of negotiation. I think for too long, the Russians, the Ukrainians have been fighting. Obviously, there's been a lot of people dying on both sides. There's been a lot of innocent loss of life. And our view is it's absurd that you've had this war go on for so long, and the two sides aren't even talking constructively about what would be necessary for them to end the conflict. And I think that one of the things that the President Trump has always been very good at, and he's gotten a lot of criticism, unfair criticism in my view, from both the American and some of the European press, is what I would call a strategic realism or a strategic insight. In other words, you don't have to agree with the Russian justification for the war, and certainly both the President and I have criticized the full-scale invasion, but you have to try to understand where the other side is coming from. to end the conflict. And I think that's what President Trump has been very deliberate about, is actually forcing the Russians to say, here is what we would like in order to end the conflict. And again, you don't have to agree with it. You can think that the request is too significant, and certainly the first peace offer that the Russians put on the table, our reaction to it was, you're asking for too much, but this is how negotiations unfold. And I wouldn't say, I'm not yet that pessimistic on this, I wouldn't say that the Russians are uninterested in bringing this thing to a resolution. What I would say is right now, the Russians are asking for a certain set of requirements, a certain set of concessions in order to end the conflict. We think they're asking for too much, okay? And then obviously, the Ukrainians matter a lot. They're the other side, they're the other party, at least to the direct conflict. And we have to ask, what is the Ukrainian, what do they need in order to bring this conflict to a successful completion?
Meanwhile, Chinese President Xi Jinping, for the first time, is trying to force Putin to end the war. Xi said that he hopes to see a fair peace deal over Ukraine. China hopes a fair, lasting and binding peace deal is accepted by all parties involved could be reached through dialogue, Xi Jinping told his Russian dictator Putin during a tea-chat in Moscow on Thursday. However, Xi didn't elaborate and specify on what a possible deal should look like. The comment appears to be his first time as Chinese leader has personally laid out principles for an agreement to end the war. As we know, in February 2023, China laid out a 12-point plan for end the war in Ukraine. Xi remarks also come after Trump says that it would be natural for him to ask China to help put more pressure on Russia to reach a deal. In a social media post, the US leader Donald Trump called for a 30-day ceasefire to pave the way for talks, threatening to impose further sanctions on Russia if a truce is violated. Meanwhile, Chinese leader Xi Jinping has expressed support for some of Russia's goals in Ukraine. Xi Jinping and Putin met personally in Moscow. In the joint statement, it is stated that the war in Ukraine could only be resolved by removing its root causes. Such formulation echoes key Russian objectives and main Russia's propaganda narratives used by the Kremlin to justify this illegal war. Xi Jinping also stated that Russia and China should be true friends of steel that have been throughout 100 trials by fire. Moreover, Xi Jinping and Putin pledged to strengthen coordination in all areas, including military, and decisively counter US course of dual containment of China and Russia. They also expressed their intention to oversee key areas of cooperation and increase trade by 2030. Also, Russian dictator Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping signed an agreement on Thursday, May 8, to further deepen the comprehensive strategic partnerships between Russia and China. The agreement was signed in the Kremlin after negotiations between Putin and Xi Jinping, who had arrived in Moscow for an official visit. In a speech following the talks, Putin stated that Russian-Chinese relations were self-sustaining and that both countries will continue to increase the proportion of their national currencies used in mutual settlements. Xi Jinping and Putin have previously also signed no-limits partnership in February 2022, several weeks before Putin invaded Ukraine. China also is Russia's largest trading partner and helping Russia to evade Western sanctions and to continue the war against Ukraine. Meanwhile, President Trump announced on Thursday that his government has reached a big trade agreement with the United Kingdom. The agreement increases access for US beef, ethanol, and other agricultural products. It is also fast-tracks American goods throughout the UK's customs process.
And it's very conclusive, and it's a great deal, and it's a very big deal, actually. I want to thank Prime Minister Starmer and his very talented team for their outstanding work and partnership. Today's agreement with the UK is the first in a series of agreements on trade that my administration has been negotiating over the past 4 weeks. With this deal, the UK joins the United States in affirming that reciprocity and fairness is an essential and vital principle of international trade. The deal includes billions of dollars of increased market access for American exports, especially in agriculture, dramatically increasing access for American beef, ethanol, and virtually all of the products produced by our great farmers. And our Secretary, as you know, of Agriculture is here. Brooke, thank you very much
Thank you.
for being here.
It's a good day. Thank you, sir.
You'll let the farmers know. In addition, the UK will reduce or eliminate numerous non-tariff barriers that unfairly discriminated against American products. But this is now turning out, I think, really to be a great deal for both countries, because it'll be really great for the UK also. So they're opening up the country. Their country is a little closed, and we appreciate that. They'll also be fast-tracking American goods through their customs process, so our exports go to a very, very quick form of approval, and there won't be any red tape. Things are going to move very quickly both ways. The final details are being written up in the coming weeks. We'll have it all very conclusive, but the actual deal is a very conclusive one. We think just about everything's been approved. So good for both countries.
Also, the British Prime Minister has told auto workers that a trade deal with the US will protect thousands of jobs in the sector and will be a great deal. The deal will save thousands of really important skilled and well-paid jobs in Britain. He told the workers that the deal means US tariffs will now be cut from 27.5% down to 10% for 1,000 vehicles every year. As a part of the deal, President Trump has agreed to cut tariffs on UK auto, steel and aluminium, while Britain will buy more American beef and streamline its customs process for goods from the United States. The symbolically resonant agreement still has yet to be finalized, but it suggests that Trump was still able to negotiate with other countries after he set out tariffs, stoked fears around the world of an economic downturn and higher inflation. The deal with the UK was the first such deal.
Really important deal. This is going to boost trade between and across our countries. It's going to not only protect jobs but create jobs, opening market access. And as you say, Donald, the timing couldn't be more apt, because not only was it 80 years ago today that victory came for Europe after and at the end of the Second World War, but of course on that day the UK and the US stood together as the closest of allies. And Donald, I think even down to the hour, because you may or may not know that it was about this time of day, exactly 80 years ago, that Winston Churchill announced victory in Europe, and that led to great celebrations across Europe, across America, but particularly in the United Kingdom. Literally people going out into the street, putting bunting up, going up to the palace. And so to be able to announce this great deal on the same day, 80 years forward, almost at the same hour, and as we were 80 years ago, with the UK and the US standing side by side, I think is incredibly important and makes this truly historic. That close relationship has endured over those 80 years. As you know, Donald, when it comes to defence and security and intelligence sharing, of course, there are no two countries that are closer than our two countries. And now we take this into new and important territory by adding trade and the economy to the closeness of our relationship. It is built, as you say, on those notions of fairness and reciprocal arrangements. We've always had a fair and balanced arrangement between our countries. This builds on that, hugely important. For sectors like car manufacturing and for steel and aluminium and so many others.
That's all for today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and glory to Ukraine.